I'm really, really excited to be here. And thank you also for acknowledging the traditional territory which we're on. We as Aboriginal people are gathering people, and whenever we gather and we share information, we always acknowledge the territory in which we are gathered. I'm really, really honored to be here with you this evening. It's not every day that you get to share something that you're truly passionate about to your core with a room full of people. So I was really excited and very honored when they reached out to me to share with you some of the work that I've been doing and really, really what I'm very, very passionate about. In terms of what I'd like to share with you this evening, you see the title there, Aboriginal Leadership and Education. I want to share with you some stories. We as Aboriginal people, we tend to share our history and our cultural knowledge through stories. And I'd like to share some stories from my personal journey with all of you, and also share some really interesting facts and research about the Aboriginal community. So just to share with you some of the context of where I grew up, she did share that I'm actually not from the Greater Toronto area. As you can see, I don't think you find this in many backyards in Toronto. I grew up very proudly in northern Saskatchewan. So my community, I am proud of proud Dene heritage from the Hatchet Lake First Nation. And I grew up in a community called Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. So for those of you familiar with the different reserves in Saskatchewan, it's beside the Beardies and Okamasas First Nation, which was a Cree First Nation. The community itself had about 1,000 people, so it was a very, very small community. I actually learned that the faculty at York University is about 500 people more than the community I grew up in, so that kind of gave me an idea of how large York University is. I had absolutely no idea. So my community was very small, and I also had what I didn't know at the time was a fairly unique upbringing. My father was a single parent. He was an artist and an entrepreneur, but he also loved the land. He was a commercial fisherman at one point in time in his life. And as the father of 3 young girls, we'd often find ourselves learning about the land, learning how to fish, learning how to fillet a fish, learning how to snare, learning how to skin animals. I remember building a quincy when I was about 14 years old, which is like an igloo of sorts, and actually sleeping it overnight in minus 30-degree weather. And I didn't really think, and I didn't even realize that this was a different upbringing than most Canadians. It was just the upbringing that I knew. And I absolutely loved it. Fast forward, I guess, a decade or so, and here I am in Toronto speaking to all of you about my upbringing, also working in financial services. So it's been a challenging journey, no doubt, but it's also been a very rewarding one. And I would attribute where I am today to one word, which is education. Education is truly, truly transformative. So let me share with you what I'm passionate about. And it might seem like it's obvious, but I think it's more broader than what actually brought us to this room today. Mark Twain famously said, the 2 most important days of a person's life are the day they were born and the day they find out why. For me, my passion is human rights and human dignity. Now, those are universal, egalitarian rights that every human being on this planet has rights to simply because they are a human being. This includes things like education. It also includes the right to have a roof over your head and food in your belly, consistent access to clean water, anti-discriminatory legislation. It's very, very complex and it's very, very global in nature, but it's something that really drives me, and this is what I'm most passionate about. And when I think about the world, all 7 billion people of us, or think about my purpose in life, I envision a world where every person has the opportunity to be their beautiful self, to reach their full and beautiful potential. Now, I realize that sounds very broad and all-encompassing, and of course you can't boil the ocean in a day. You have to, kind of have a laser focus and focus on one area. And for me, my area of focus is Indigenous human rights, and specifically in Canada for the Aboriginal people. And that's exactly what I'll be focusing on. And you might be wondering, and it might seem obvious, why is this important to me? Why are human rights and Indigenous rights so important to me? I'd like to just have a show of hands for those of you who have little nieces or little nephews, or little cousins, or kids of your own. And if you're like me, you suffer from proud auntie syndrome, whereby you show rooms full of strangers photos of them, because I love them so, so, so much. And when I think about Ethan and Sydney, so these aren't my children. These are actually my older sister, her two little ones. So Ethan is 6 and Sydney is 3. Ethan is like most 6-year-olds. His hero right now is Batman. And before that, that was Bumblebee. And before that, it was Spider-Man. And if you give him any kind of Legos, he will build you some sort of spaceship that's supposed to blow something up. He absolutely loves it. And Sydney, as you can imagine, is like most 3-year-olds. She is an adventurous princess. She goes through, in any given day, and I'm actually not lying, up to 3 wardrobe changes on her own regard. She'll come home from school or from daycare and she'll put a dress on and then she'll dress before dinner. And she's very adventurous. She loves going to the beach. She loves adventuring out into the woods. She's a very, very adventurous 3-year-old. And when I envision the world, for me, my passion is for them to have the full choice and full opportunity, like any child in the world, to succeed. And it breaks my heart to tell you that statistics show us this isn't the case. That my little niece and my little nephew face so many barriers that they don't have the full opportunity to succeed like other children do. I was at a conference this last week, and it was an amazing conference. We heard from speakers like Bill Clinton. We closed the conference with Kofi Annan. It was called One Young World. My employer was generous enough to sponsor me to go. And we also heard from Muhammad Yunus. So for those of you who know Muhammad Yunus, he's a Nobel Peace Laureate. He's the father of microfinance. He's literally lifted millions of people out of poverty through one simple idea that he had. And we heard from him, and he's a very, very, very inspiring speaker. And he told us a story, something that really, really resonated with me. And it was a simple story. He said, if you have a whole bunch of seeds, and he used the analogy of a bonsai seed, and you put that seed in a pot, but that pot is small, that seed, even though it's the best seed you can find, will not grow to its full potential, because it needs the nourishment and it needs the space to grow. When I think about that, I think of Ethan and Sydney, and I think of how they have been dealt in life a smaller pot, and that they don't currently have the space and nourishment they need to grow. Now, what does nourishment include? It includes things like education, access, opportunity, positive reinforcement, and positive role models. And like most 3- and 6-year-olds, they don't have much choice about the world that they grow up in. And again, that breaks my heart. But, and it's a big but, I do have a say in some small regard in the world that they grow up in. So I'm dedicating my life until the day I die to make sure that Ethan and Sydney and thousands of other children, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, have equal opportunity to succeed and the ability to reach their full potential. And that's what drives me. That's why I wake up in the morning. And that's why I fight like I do. Because I believe it can happen, and I believe that I have some small role to play in that. So why are we here? We're going to talk about Aboriginal leadership. We're going to talk about Aboriginal education. But first, before we do that, I think we all have to we have to understand the Aboriginal marketplace and the context in which we live in as Canadians. So just to give you a broad overview of the community, I'll be talking about these 4 broad areas. Of course, it's much more large and much more complex than we can really cover in an hour, but I'll do my best to do that. And the reality is that these 4 areas, we'll call them, they move on. The world moves on around us, whether or not we choose to participate. organizations, large multinational organizations, they make choices, they allocate resources, they choose who to employ, where to employ them, whether or not you choose to sit at the table. Large governments and our leaders, they allocate millions of dollars and they affect millions of Canadians with every decision they make every day. So the world moves on whether we choose to participate in it or not. Now, from an Aboriginal population perspective, let's start with the first one. Aboriginal, and I'm going to start at the very, very basics here. This actually encompasses 3 very separate and distinct cultural groups. And those are First Nations, status and non-status, Métis, and Inuit people. And we're in and around 4% of the Canadian population. We're actually just under 4%. By 2017, we're estimated to be about 4.1%, and we're growing. And we're also not always where you think we are, where most Canadians think we are. Over half of the Aboriginal population reside in urban areas. So First Nations, Métis, Inuit. Within the First Nations category, about 70% of First Nations people live off of reserve. So either in rural areas or in the cities. And within the First Nations category again, there's over 50 different First Nations linguistic groups in Canada. For those of you who've ever sat in an anthropology class, the study of culture, Anthropology 101, first day, probably within the first hour, they will tell you that language is the root of culture. So those are 50 different linguistic groups within First Nations alone. So you're already seeing how diverse the population is. We're also very fast growing. We're actually the fastest growing demographic in Canada, believe it or not. We have twice the annual growth rate than non-Aboriginal Canadians. Our year-over-year growth rate is about 1.8%, and for non-Aboriginal Canadians, it's about 0.7%, so it's just over double. So that's really significant. And we're also very young. In the 2006 census, half of our population is under the age of 24. So we're young, and we're growing, meaning that the fastest growing demographic in Canada, the country we all live in, is the Aboriginal youth population. That's significant, and it affects a lot of things, which I'll be discussing. From a more localized context, just to understand the Aboriginal community in and around Toronto, the city of Toronto has around 26,000 Aboriginal people according to the 2006 census. The next census data comes out in a couple of years, or maybe next year, and I'm guessing it's going to be significantly higher than that, given our rate of urbanization. So it's really significant. I also want to talk about, I talked about my passion being human rights, and that also includes things like development, poverty, and inequality. Now, these are raw statistics. These are statistics that they're not fun to talk about, but they're very, very, very true, and I've seen them. Now, the average income of an Aboriginal person in Canada is about 30% lower than the average Canadian household. It's around $37,000 per household. That income, because Aboriginal people, we're very family and community oriented, especially in our extended families. If you're earning $37,000 a year, you're likely the highest income earner in your family. And that income is likely being spread across more people than the average Canadian household, having 2 parents and 2 children. So that income is spread more thin. And also for those living in northern communities, where a gallon of milk can cost you $20, $37,000 over 1 year doesn't get you very far. I'd also like to address a quick myth that many Canadians, I've come across. It's that Aboriginal people don't pay taxes. I can assure you, I pay my fair share of income taxes. I also pay property taxes. The only segment of the population that would be true for is if you're an income earner living on reserve. So every other Aboriginal person, if you're a First Nations person living off reserve, earning income off reserve, which is the majority of the population, you are paying income taxes, you are paying property taxes, and you're mostly paying sales tax in most provinces. Now, there's also a lot of complexity when it comes to why this is the case, why you hear about inequality, you hear about poverty, you hear about issues going on reserve. And there's a lot of complexity there. So much so that I really don't have enough time. It would take a lecture for a full semester for me to actually kind of get into meaningfully why that is the way it is. What I will leave you with is a result of the colonization and attempted assimilation of Aboriginal people through residential schools. One of the largest scars, in my view, on Canadian history, and one that we don't really educate our students about, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal. And so there's a lot of misconceptions as to why the state of affairs is the way it is. And there's also a lot of complex jurisdictional issues. When Canada was founded under treaty relationships, it was on a nation-to-nation basis, meaning the First Nations to the Crown and to the federal government. And that's how they deal. So when things like education, which are typically under provincial jurisdiction, it's actually the federal government on First Nations that's handling that. And it's severely underfunded. And I'll get to that in one moment. And also access. We talk about things like clean water. We're in Canada in the year 2012. When we travel, we talk about how proud we are. I'm assuming most of us have traveled. And we go to Canada, and we talk about the States. Oh, no, we're not like the States. We travel somewhere and say, come to Canada. We have equal opportunity. We have clean water. You can do anything you want. But that's not for First Nations. And it's not something we like talking about. When I read a white paper a few years ago about water issues on reserves. And I read it. I read it. I'm like, this is really sad. I've seen these issues, and but I'd never lived on reserve. And so I read it. It made me very upset. But I kind of just left it. I thought, okay, I know this, but it doesn't affect me. Until recently, my sister, the beautiful and amazing mother, she's one of my many heroes and role models, who's the mother of Ethan and Sydney. She's 2 years older than me. She put herself through education, through post-secondary education, raising 2 children because she wanted a better life for them. And she also wanted them to be close to their culture, to learn their language. Remember, language is the root of culture. And she wanted them to be rooted in their cultural upbringing and be strong Dene children, which I admire her for. So she took a teaching job in a reserve in northern Saskatchewan. And I was on the phone with Glenda, her name's Glenda, a few weeks ago. We were talking about, how's your teaching job going? She'd been there for about a month or so. And she said something that really struck a chord with me. She said, it's good, she's talking about her class. She's like, but there's no water here. So what do you mean there's no water? She's like, well, where I live on reserve, we don't have water all the time. I said, what do you mean you have no water? I don't know when the water is going to come on. For those of you with children, can you imagine being a mother, not knowing when you can cook for your children, when you can clean your children, when you can wash their clothes and clean your home and provide a safe environment for your children? Water is a basic human right, and there are thousands of Canadians that live without it. So that is, in my view, really just scratching the surface in terms of some of the development challenges going on in Canada. But I just wanted to, start to paint the picture of how large and complex the Aboriginal community is in Canada. Now, education. So it's not all bad. I think that there's a lot of positive movement happening in the community. And this is what I really want to get into, this whole education. Nelson Mandela once said, he said, education is the single most powerful tool you can use to change the world. When I first stepped into university, I had no idea how transformative that experience would be for me. It's literally changed my life in more ways than one. And the good news is that from an education Aboriginal perspective, there's a study done 2 years ago in 2010, and they found that education was the leading aspiration for most urban Aboriginals in Canada, the majority of Aboriginal people in Canada. So regardless of how old you were, where you lived in Canada, so what your background was, we all saw education as a key investment in our future. The sad news is that Indigenous youth in Canada, remember, we're the fastest growing demographic in Canada, we're also the least likely to finish high school. If you are a First Nations child or a child living on reserve, like Ethan, like Sydney, the dropout rate for them before they finish high school is as high as 60%. 60%. I'm not even going to talk about things like suicide either, because those are very prevalent in First Nations reserves, and actually an issue that affected me personally. So these are things, you're fighting a lot of challenges just to finish secondary school. There's also funding issues. So the funding, and this is, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but the funding for Aboriginal students on reserve can be up to 40 to 50% less than if you're off of reserve. And that kind of goes back to the provincial versus federal versus First Nation relationship. But the funding really hasn't changed. And as this demographic is growing, the funding isn't changing. So the per capita funding for each student on reserve is actually getting lower and lower. And they're fighting this uphill battle, trying to finish secondary school, trying to get into university. But there's a lot of obstacles in their way. And going back to Muhammad Yunus's example, you're going to plant a good seed in a smaller pot, and then you're going to give it 40 to 50% less nourishment. And you're going to look at it and say, why aren't you growing? Why aren't you growing? That's the issue that a lot of Aboriginal people, at least living on reserve, face. And it's very sad. Now, but there's also, I once heard somebody say, and this is how I live my life, if you want a big opportunity, go and find yourself a big challenge. There's a lot of challenges here, but there's also a lot of opportunity. The upside potential is enormous. Now, I work in financial services. Numbers speak to me. Business cases speak to me. How about these numbers? If educational gaps were eliminated in Canada, the Aboriginal population, the Aboriginal people would add 71 million to the Canadian economy by 2017. So in 5 years' time, 27 million. If we were to eliminate the skills and education gap with Aboriginal people, it would add an additional 400 billion, with a B, in additional revenue to the Canadian economy in one generation, and save an estimated 250 billion in social costs. So just to give you an idea of how big that difference is, because sometimes I forget how big a million and a billion are. A million seconds pass by in 12 days. So every 12 days, a million seconds has gone by. A billion seconds is 31 years. So 400 billion in revenue, 250 saved in social costs. If you were to walk into a leader's office, they have this great business plan for you. It's going to give you $400 billion. It's going to save you $250 billion. What do you think they'd say? Yeah, let's do it. Sounds like a great opportunity. The upside sounds amazing. But of course, there's a lot of complexity. There's jurisdictional issues. There's politics. There's legacies. There's mistrust. And meanwhile, unfortunately, it's Sydney and it's Ethan that are suffering. And that breaks my heart. Now, from a business and employment perspective, so there's a lot of upside. There's a lot of upside to education, and when you invest in education, your economy will prosper. There's many, many, many studies that tell us this. Before, again, I get into the statistics of the economics for the case of business and education, I want to share with you a story. I was in Japan actually 2 years in November, so almost 2 years ago. And I was attending another World Summit called the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. And basically, it's a summit where 21 member economies around the Asia-Pacific region get together and they discuss, creating a free trade region and mutual prosperity between the regions. And when I was there, I was interested in Canadian trade policy. I was interested in meeting with leaders from, other organizations around the world, asking them why they're interested in Canada, and learning about sort of their business needs, and just kind of understanding the global context in which we all operate in, and from a business perspective. And what surprised me was, and maybe it shouldn't have surprised me now that I reflect on it, was when I talked to different, especially Japanese businessmen or businesswomen. And we'd talk about, and sometimes during the conversation, we're having a cup of coffee, and it would come across that I was Indigenous, that I was a First Nations person in Canada. And it was like, a light bulb went off in their head. And they would start asking me really educated questions about Aboriginal people in Canada. So much so that I would actually say they were more educated questions. And I mean, there's no good question, no bad question. But you could tell that they were clearly more educated about Aboriginal people in Canada than most Canadians that I've met. And I was like, what? Why is this so? Upon reflection, you think about, the Japanese economy. They're a manufacturing-based economy. They rely heavily on resources. Canada is a resource-based economy. There's tensions right now between Japan and China. Japan doesn't want to rely forever on the Chinese government for the resources that they need to manufacture the goods and services they provide. Australia is another resource-based economy, but Canada is another one. Very, very rich resource-based economy. These Japanese businessmen knew about the rights of Aboriginal people to the land. Did you know that Canada is one of 2 countries in the world that has the rights of our Indigenous people enshrined in our Constitution? The other country is Bolivia. And Bolivia is that way because the majority of their population is actually Indigenous. So Canada, where our population is about 4%, the rights of Indigenous people, the right inherent to our land, is enshrined in our Constitution. And that will not change. I can't see Prime Minister Harper or the Queen sort of ripping up our Constitution tomorrow. That's the way it is. And these businessmen knew. They knew. They'd ask me, how does your community feel about investment? How is it growing up in your community? What kind of resources did you have near your community? What other organizations, what mining, extraction, forestry, agriculture organizations worked in and around your community, and what were those relationships like? And how can we start to do business there? So that was a light bulb moment to say, wow, the rest of the world sort of knows about Aboriginal people. Why don't Canadians? And this is something that we all rely on from an economic perspective. From a bottom line perspective, this affects all of us. The Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business estimates that by 2016, so not that far away, the Aboriginal market will reach $32 billion, and that includes household, business, and government income. That's significant. From a business perspective, Aboriginal people are very entrepreneurial, very, very entrepreneurial. In 2006, there was an estimated 35,000 Aboriginal-owned businesses in Canada, which was an 85% increase from a decade earlier. So although I've been pointing out some of these very raw, very real, very grim statistics about the state of the Canadian economy and the state of Aboriginal people in Canada, if we actually look at the trending of sort of where we were a decade, maybe 15 years ago, to where we are today and where we're going, I'm really, really happy to report that we're trending in the right area. That Aboriginal people are coming up against a lot of challenges, and they're saying, you know what? We want to prosper. We want our children, our children's children, our children's children's children to prosper. And we have the ability to make that change happen. So they're investing in themselves, and they're investing in businesses, and they're starting businesses. So another interesting fact, that of these 35,000 businesses, 51% of them are wholly owned or partly owned by women, which is compared to 47% of non-Aboriginal businesses, so women play a large role. They're also more likely to pursue post-secondary education than women. We have higher educational attainment levels among women than men in the Aboriginal population. So a lot of these businesses are linked to service economies, so construction and business services, and about 13% are linked to resources. Now, so again, talking about those trends, between 2001 and 2011, household income of Aboriginal people, so we talked about how it's about 37%, it's actually been increasing by a rate of 7.5% year over year. And in 2001, it was about 6.9 billion. In 2011, it was 14.1 billion. So it's trending in the right direction, which is, I'm really, really happy to report. And I think that it's the generation in front of mine and my generation that's a big part of that, paving those ways for success. From an employment perspective, it's probably no secret that there are higher unemployment rates among Aboriginal people. But because the way Stats Canada does their data, it's actually really hard to tell what exactly those numbers are, but they are higher than the Canadian average. Now, I already talked about the population growth in the Aboriginal community. Aboriginal population is expected to account for 12.7% of the labor force growth, 11.3% of employment growth between 2006 and 2026. Those are fairly large numbers if you think about how much our community is growing. So it's kind of exponential in the way we're growing. And in 2001,
so 2001 to today, the working age population has increased by 25% among Aboriginal Canadians. Do you have any idea what it is among non-Aboriginal Canadians? So 25 for Aboriginal, 6% for non-Aboriginal Canadians. Now let's think about the context that we all live in again. So I talked about how we're growing, but what else is growing? I'll give you a hint, it's leaving the workforce. The baby boomers, they're retiring. Organizations need leaders. We're looking for that talent. And so yes, I think immigration is part of the solution. I think it's a complex problem that requires a slightly complex solution. But I also think that we can start to nurture a population that we have right in our backyard where there's so many benefits for us to do so, including that. So, tremendous amount of growth in the working age population with Aboriginal people. Now, from a community aspirations, let's link these all together. So we have a growing population with tremendous development issues, but we know education is the key to our future. If we invest in education, we invest in our development, we will see tremendous business and employment and economic growth for all Canadians. So that's sort of linking them together. There was this great CBC docuseries that aired earlier this year. There's a 4-part docuseries by the CBC. If you have a chance to watch it, I really, really recommend doing so. It's called Eighth Fire. Amazing. And they profile a lot of what I'm going to call modern day Indigenous experiences. They're those stories that you don't often hear. And there was this one lady in there, she said, really profoundly, I thought, she was a young mother, and she said, education is the new buffalo. How great is that? Education is the new buffalo. Buffalo was the animal that many Aboriginal people, many First Nations people, for centuries, for thousands and thousands of years before Canada was settled, relied on. And it provided home, it provided clothing, it provided food, it provided warmth, it provided all of the elements we needed to live for sustenance. Education is the new buffalo. And when you think about, I already mentioned we're a gathering people. We're all gathered here this evening. We're also a communal people. When I was in Ottawa last week, and I was walking through, I think it's called the Museum of Canadian Civilization. It's on the Gatineau side. And I was walking through the First Peoples exhibit, and I was looking at all the artifacts, reading all the stories and all the learnings they had on the walls. And there was one exhibit that kind of caught my attention. It was the communal hunting, because that was sort of right where I grew up, right in the Cree territory of the Plains. And they were talking about how in communal hunting, we all have our role to play. That we can do more as a community working together with less resources than we can by ourselves. So if I see that buffalo, I have a much better chance if we all as a group work together and we're hunting that buffalo, and we can get more of those buffalo and we can survive on more with less of our resources versus me just going out there and trying to get it myself. So I think about that, and I think about the role I do in business, the role I do in the community, the role we're all doing through education, through big things and little things. We all have a role to play for us as Canadians to get to that buffalo. Now, one of the reasons why I'm sure I was asked to speak here this evening was not only because I'm a First Nations person and I'm very passionate about all of the information I just shared with you, but also because I try in my small way to make a difference. Now, this is an organization that was mentioned earlier that I co-founded about a year ago. It's called the Aboriginal Professional Association of Canada. Now, APAC, as we call it, the idea for this organization was really founded out of my own experience. So picture, being out of university, the first in your family to finish university and get a university education. And you have this amazing employment opportunity. And you know in your heart of hearts that it's a good thing to do. And for the first time in your life, you purchase a one-way ticket. And where you're going, you have no friends. Where you're going, you have no family. All you know is you have a shoebox of a condo downtown and a job. And that's how I was 2 years ago, not that long ago. And I was very overwhelmed and I was very scared, and I'm okay with saying that because that's the way it was. And like most human beings, You know, you need a sense of community. You need a sense of people around you to support you, for you, you know, to feel safe and to feel nurtured. And to be honest with you, I was very scared. I was very scared because, one, I thought, are they going to think I'm an idiot? You know, am I doing the right thing? Am I well prepared for this role? That was one reason why I was scared. The other reason was, in the years leading up to 2010, I really was on this amazing journey of self-discovery. You know, I talked about how transformative my education experience was. And part of it was not only because I was able to travel and to learn from amazing people and have great mentors and attend amazing classes, but it was also because I was more purposefully walking down the journey of self-discovery as to who I was as an Aboriginal person, and an Aboriginal woman, and a Dene woman. And I didn't want for me to be uprooted from my family, my friends, and my cultural community and lose that when I moved to Toronto. So naturally, when I moved, I said, okay, let's pick up the phone, let's go to Google, let's find, you know, how can I Google something, you know, Aboriginal Professional Network, Aboriginal Leadership Network. And to my surprise, there was no one such organization that existed within the Greater Toronto region. It floored me. I had no idea. There's over 70 cultural professional associations within the Greater Toronto area that I'm aware of. There's probably a lot more. But there was no one organization for Aboriginal people. So that's how the idea was born. Later on in 2011, I was selected for a fellowship through Civic Action called Diverse City. Diverse City is one word. And through that program, they choose 25 what they call up-and-coming city builders, and they give them the skills, the resources, and the blue space to create civic change. And out of 25 fellows that year, we proposed 14 different ideas, and 5 were ultimately selected in around the March timeframe. And I had lobbied and lobbied and lobbied among 25 people. I'm like, this is a good idea, please. And it, like, to my, you know, my heart exploded the day it was selected. So I had a team of 7 volunteers who said, Gabrielle, I think this is an okay idea. Let's try and make it a reality by the end of the year. And so we were off. I couldn't have a broad level timeline. I won't get into all of the details. Believe me, it was a lot more work than this nice linear thing, you know, shows. It was very hard. It wasn't easy. But I was very, very passionate about it. For about 6 months, we did a lot of community engagement. I met one-on-one with a lot of Aboriginal professionals. I met with organizations that worked in and around the Aboriginal community, Aboriginal organizations. I met with elders, and I asked them, I talked to them about this idea. And in about the September timeframe, we had a concept. We had this Aboriginal Professional Association of Canada, and at that time, we also realized that it was a Canada-wide need. Now, what we focus on as an organization is Aboriginal leadership. If I had to say what we do in a nutshell, we are a supportive community and platform for Aboriginal professionals. We focus on adult education and leadership. I've already talked to you about, it sounds impersonal when I say pipeline, but that's how I think about it. So you think of Aboriginal students. If you finish high school, you just came up against a lot of statistics and barriers that were in your way, and that should be celebrated. And you make the decision. Oftentimes, they're the first in their family, like I was, to go to university. And once you're in university, you know, you go through all the challenges. Most of us, we're in a university right now. We know it's not easy. You go through those challenges and you finish. You finish university, and you should be celebrated. Because the statistics show us that for you to get there, it was very, very difficult, and you're up against a lot of things. Now, why, and I asked myself, why, once they get into the workforce, why would we leave them? Sometimes they're the first in their family to get a job in an organization like, you know, RBC. I work at RBC. I was the first in my family to work in a large matrixed organization. My father was an entrepreneur. He never had a manager. You know, I didn't know that I was supposed to CC people on emails when I sent them out. I didn't know the sort of politics and things that go on within large organizations. I kind of had to figure that out myself. And it would have been a lot easier if I had a community of people who are like me, to support and to lean on, to talk about our experiences, to share our experiences, and to get mentorship from people who'd already gone through those experiences. And then for me to turn around and mentor others who might go through similar experiences. And that was sort of the vision that APAC was founded on. I'm going to refer to it as APAC because the Aboriginal Professional Association of Canada is a bit of a mouthful. So when I say APAC, that's what I'm referring to. And we were founded on 3 platforms, or in 3 pillars. Now, the first being professional development. So we facilitate opportunities for Aboriginal professionals to learn new professional skill sets or sharpen the ones that they already have. We also provide network development. So like I already mentioned about the supportive community, allowing Aboriginal professionals to support one another, network with one another, but also get tapped into other leadership communities. So we're facilitating those relationships. The third pillar that we're founded on is the recognition of excellence. I think it's extremely important for people to have role models to look up to. When I was 15, one person in one moment changed my life because they told me they believed in me. I probably wouldn't have tried hard in school if it wasn't for that person. I probably wouldn't have went to university if it wasn't that person. One role model saying one nice thing to you at one point in your life has the power to transform. And now imagine if we can create a community of these role models, the change that that can create in the community. So the third pillar, although it's not as tangible, I can't record necessarily. I can tell you how many role models we've profiled. We profile a role model every month, and we're also launching an Aboriginal Professional of the Year award. So creating platforms for these people who've been up against a lot of things to showcase the successes that they've had, because they're tremendous and amazing successes and should be celebrated, in my opinion. Now, since we launched a year ago, I really had no idea how big this organization would get. I have to say I was kind of naive walking into it. I said, I have an idea. Let's just get together, once a month. That's what I thought it would be. In the last year, so since we launched in November of last year, we've provided over $2,500 worth of event tickets to our members for free. That's to events like at the Canadian Club, the Toronto Board of Trade, networking events, events to conferences. In the last year, we've designed over $10,000 worth of APAC events, so events that we've put on and facilitated. So 6 events we've done in the last year. I'm very proud, very, very, very proud and very amazed at the power of teamwork. We have an 8-member volunteering executive, including myself. We just recently, in the last 6 weeks, onboarded 4 new volunteers. And in the next month, the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're hiring our first full-time staff. So in 1 year, we grew from being, people in an idea or in a room with an idea to hiring our first full-time staff and contributing to the economy by hiring somebody. That's pretty cool. I thought it was pretty cool. And over the last year, so out of about 8 executive volunteers, we've put in around 2,000 volunteer hours. That's 1 full-time position for a year we've done in volunteer hours. And we do it because we believe in it. We believe in the impact that we're having. We know it's not necessarily measurable today, but I believe that Ethan and Sydney, because of the work that I'm doing, when they finish university in 20 years, that they will believe that they can be the next CEO of RBC, that they can be a prime minister if they want to, and never know that there wasn't a gap there, that they, at one point in time, wouldn't have had the opportunity or even necessarily believed in themselves that they could do that. So my dream, and how I'll measure success from this, one of probably many projects in my life, will be if that happens or not. Now, in terms of our membership, we have a great membership. Our goal at the beginning of the year was to have around 100 members by the end of the year. We said if we have 100 people who get together, we support one another, that's 100 more people than we had last year. We hit that target in May, primarily through word of mouth. We don't really tell people what we're doing. This is probably one of the most public events that I've done in terms of, actually, Metro Morning. I take that back. Metro Morning was I didn't realize how big Metro Morning was when I was on it, to be honest with you. But here I am because of that. So we have 185 members the last time I checked, and that's growing. It grows by 10 to 20% every month. Primarily, we ask them, how did you hear of us? From a friend, from a colleague, from a family member. So word of mouth. That means that we're providing value, and they're thinking this is a good idea, so they're referring people to us, which is great. 90% of our members, of that 185 people, have a post-secondary degree or higher. 60%, similar to educational rights in Canada, are women, around 60%. And these aren't just junior people. I'm a fairly junior person in my organization. They're not junior. They're partners at some of the largest, accounting and consultancy firms in Canada. One of our members works at the UN in New York. One of our members owns a theater company. Some of them are entrepreneurs. Some of them work in financial services. Many of them work for the government, and then different leadership positions. So they're very diverse, and they're amazing professionals. When you get together in a room, the energy is electric, because we've never really had the opportunity to do that. So it's a lot of fun. And I will say this. Now, this idea, it's not very innovative. It's a professional association. It's saying, let's get together and support one another. It's not innovative. I already said there's about 70 in the GTA, probably thousands across Canada. But it was an innovative idea for Aboriginal people. Innovation does not necessarily mean invention. It can mean taking an existing idea and putting it in a new marketplace. And this wasn't, like I said, it wasn't an innovative idea, but it was really useful in the Aboriginal community. So this tells me a few things. And one thing for certain is that I think that there's a lot of value in taking other existing ideas and bringing them into the Aboriginal community. I don't need so much so that I don't even know what they would be just yet, but I plan on, over my lifetime, finding out what they are. Another thing, and I'm getting close to the end here, that I want to point out is you're probably wondering, or maybe you've wondered at one point in time, so Gabrielle, you're very passionate about human rights of all kinds, for all communities, but right now you're focusing on the Aboriginal community. You have this organization, you're hiring a full-time staff. Why are you working at a bank? That's a fair question. And it's one that I've been doing a lot of reading about this subject lately, and it's one that I'm really, really passionate and interested in. And it's so new that when I typed it into the computer when I was writing my notes, it wanted to spell check it. But it is a word, I promise you. So 2 words, social entrepreneurship. So we know what a social entrepreneur is. They start new businesses that ask not only what do we do as a business, what contributes to our bottom line, but how do we do it? It provides social value in the way they do business. We know what entrepreneurship is, starting a new business. Intrapreneurship, working within businesses with an entrepreneurial mindset. So I consider myself to be a social entrepreneur. I mentioned earlier that as communal people, we all have our role to play. There's no one silver bullet. Now, I believe that educators, politicians, leaders of large organizations, we all have a role to play as we hunt this buffalo. And for me, the area that I'm interested in from a professional capacity is working in large organizations. Now, can I have impact in the community if I'm an executive director of this organization? The answer is yes. But I can also have a lot of impact of this organization if I'm the CEO of RBC. I'm not saying that that's my aspiration, but I'm not saying that it's not. That's very Dalton McGuinty of me up until a few days ago. I can have a lot of impact from within a large organization because I'll have a brand, I'll have a network, and I'll have resources behind me. Now, where I work today, I work in wealth management. I do strategy in wealth management, our wealth management business. On any given day, the word Aboriginal does not come out of my mouth. I do not deal with the Aboriginal marketplace. But the colleagues that I work with know that I'm First Nations. So maybe, just maybe, I'm planting a little seed in their head that says maybe Aboriginal people aren't what I thought they were. Maybe what I heard on the 6 o'clock news isn't the case for all Aboriginal people, because I work with Gabrielle. She's educated, and she's come up against a lot, and she's making a difference. So those small seeds that I plant as I go, I'm hoping that one day they'll grow. Maybe a forest will grow. And I'm very, very passionate about the work I get to do. Now, I really appreciate all the time that I've had this evening. And I want to leave you with a couple of things. I saw a speaker a few months ago, and she said, we write our history every single day. I just shared with you, over the course of maybe 30 minutes, some facts that are true. They are true. They are Canada that we live in. And one day in the future, they will be in a history book somewhere. A history book that maybe your child picks up or your grandchildren pick up. And they might learn it in school when they come to visit you at Thanksgiving or they come to visit you and they ask you, I heard about this in school. And they ask you, what did you do? What will you say? We have the choice and opportunity to write our history every single day. I believe you don't have to be a Muhammad Yunus. You don't have to lift millions of people out of poverty. But you can be that person that when one person says something that's maybe untrue are maybe misinformed about Aboriginal people, you can say, you know what, that's not the case. I heard this somewhere. Because that can make a huge difference too. And the story I want to leave you with is an elder that I work with a lot, that I consult with a lot here in Toronto. He shared with me this story. And he said he was walking one day through the snow. And he was walking with his little son, and his son was about 4 years old at the time. And for those of you who've ever been in deep snow, I have, I grew up in northern Saskatchewan. You're trudging through deep snow, like you're going, and it's not easy. You pick it up, the weight of your boots, and you're going and you're trudging through that snow. His little son was walking behind him. And he said, Dad, it's really easy for me to step where you've stepped. Now we think about that. We think about the lives that we're leading. Every day, I believe every single one of us in some way, shape, or form, whether in the Aboriginal community or not, you're pioneers. You're paving a way. You're paving a way for the next generation. That's a tremendous responsibility. And it's something that I think, that's how I try and live my life, by being a pioneer, but also through my professional association. For those that have walked in front of me, maybe beside me in different ways, making sure that their footsteps don't get blown over, that we remember those role models, remember those success stories, and we profile them. So that's something that I think a lot about in terms of how I live my life. How can I walk, be a role model, but also walk in a good way with tremendous responsibility for the generations that follow ours. Now, so I have to put a bit of a plug in here at the end. This is what I'll leave you with. So, my call to action, so I kind of set the context, I showed you some information. Now, my call to action is if you're an Aboriginal professional, if you're an Aboriginal student, look us up on the internet, join our professional association. I know from other professional examples that people have been telling me very personally that we have impact, that we affect them. Engage in the community. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. Hopefully some of you have been tweeting along the way. We had a hashtag up there and Twitter handle. So engage with us. Like us on Facebook. We'll share some interesting information about the Aboriginal community. We also have an event coming up on November 1st for Aboriginal professionals, and we're going to focus on skill building and networking. So that's on November 1st. I have some contact information. If you'd like to reach out to me, I'd be more than happy to chat with you about that. And I'll also leave you with, I've been sharing with you some education in the last hour, but if you have any other questions, reach out to me personally. There's my email. I'm more than happy to answer them. I'm more than happy to engage with you and plant those small seeds, in the communities that we all live in. So that's my lecture. Thank you, and Chimigwich.
My name is Randy Pitawanakwat, and I am the coordinator of Aboriginal Student Services on campus. And I've been asked to provide some closing remarks for tonight's session. So first of all, I would like to thank all of you for coming out tonight for this presentation on Aboriginal leadership and education. I would also like to extend the thanks to the York Centre for Education and Community for organizing this special event. And the Centre for Aboriginal Student Services is delightful in participating in this event as well. And of course, I would like to thank, special thanks to our guest speaker tonight, Gabrielle Scrimshaw, for her insights on her talk here on Aboriginal issues and people, particularly with the mentioning the Aboriginal demographics and what it means to Canada. And also as well as your personal journey on how you came to where you are today. So as Gabrielle mentioned, Aboriginal youth is the fastest growing population here in Canada. And for an example, as she mentioned, Aboriginal youth under the age of 24 actually represent more than half of the Aboriginal population, and this is a really significant number. So, governments need to develop strategies and policies that, to take advantage of this opportunity by creating investments for Aboriginal youth. And but this is also a challenge as well, because there are many challenges out there, and many of the challenges stem from the poor socioeconomic conditions that many of the Aboriginal youth live in today. So in closing, I'd just like to, I hope this presentation and the discussions afterwards have provided a good insight and a better understanding for not only the opportunities, but for the challenges that Aboriginal peoples face, particularly youth. So now I'd like to call on Louise Gormley.
Thank you for that, Randy. And we thank the Centre for Aboriginal Student Service at York for collaborating with us on this event. It's my pleasure tonight to say thank you and to offer the closing. I just want to share a few thoughts. As Gabrielle was talking tonight, I reflected on a few things. In particular, I noted that she used the word community very often. You said communal people, sense of community. We all have a role to play. And it struck me the extent to which community building, that sense of developing relationships with and within community, is so much a part of your vision and so much a part of the vision as well of the Center for Education and Community. And I see a real ideological affinity and on-the-ground affinity in that vision of community being so integral to youth achievement and student engagement. And I also found that phrase that you use, you can't boil the ocean in a day. The first time I had ever heard that was on the CBC interview, and you used it, and you used it again tonight. And I'm impressed because we so often see the long-term goal, but it's so important to remember that it's those small and progressive steps that little by little will get us where we want. And the other thing that struck me was when you talked about the highly lucrative economic and financial implications for society as a whole, from a more fully engaged Aboriginal population. And so I appreciated the focus on the practical aspect of this as well. So I think that everyone here probably is now wanting to go home. And we want to thank you all very much for coming out tonight. It's a rainy night. And the basement auditorium is a little bit hard to find, but you all made the effort, and we thank you for that. And we also really appreciate the insightful and inquisitive questions that enrich the discussion. And finally, I'd like to thank Gabrielle for a wonderful keynote lecture. It was our honor to have you as the YCEC 2012 public lecture keynote speaker, and as one person in the audience said, it was like being at a TED Talk. So without further ado, we have a small token of appreciation for you, and we thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very sweet of you. Thank you.